Sometime around 1200 BC, every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed within a single generation. The Hittite Empire, erased. Mycenaean Greece, reduced to ruins. The great trading cities of the Levant, burned, abandoned, silent. Egypt survived, but barely, and never recovered its former reach. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and for over a century, no one could fully explain how so many powerful civilizations fell almost simultaneously. But one theory keeps gaining ground, and it centers on a soft, dull, completely unremarkable metal that made up barely a tenth of the alloy that held the entire world together. This is Object Origins, a channel about the things that quietly shape civilization, and today's object is tin. Worth saying up front, ancient history involves a lot of interpretation. Where evidence is strong, I'll say so directly. Where it's debated, I'll flag that too. What I want to show you isn't just the history of tin. It's why a metal most people never think about was the single most critical resource of the ancient world, and why its disappearance might have triggered the greatest civilizational catastrophe before the fall of Rome. Bronze changed everything. Before it, tools were stone or copper, soft copper that bent under pressure, dulled fast, and couldn't hold a real edge. Then, somewhere around 3300 BC, someone discovered that if you mixed roughly 90% copper with just 10% tin, you got something radically different. Bronze. Harder, sharper, more durable. It held an edge. It could be cast into complex shapes. Weapons, armor, axe heads, chisels, ship fittings. Bronze didn't just improve technology, it restructured power itself. The civilizations that mastered bronze dominated: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece. But here's the problem nobody talks about. Copper was relatively common across the ancient world. Cyprus, Anatolia, the Sinai. Tin was not. Tin is one of the rarest metals on Earth's surface. The major deposits that the Bronze Age world could actually access were scattered in places that were, for a Mediterranean civilization, staggeringly far away. Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, and a rain-soaked peninsula at the very edge of the known world, Cornwall, in what is now southwest England. Think about what that means. The entire Bronze Age, every weapon, every tool, every piece of infrastructure depended on a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles. And that supply chain existed. This is the part that doesn't get enough attention. The ancient tin trade created what might have been the first truly long-distance commercial network in human history. Phoenician traders, the greatest seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean, sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out into the open Atlantic, and north along the coast of Europe to reach the Cornwall tin mines. This was happening roughly 2,000 years before Julius Caesar ever set foot in Britain. The Greeks had a name for these distant sources, the catastrophic, the Tin Islands. And here's what makes the ancient tin trade even more remarkable. The Phoenicians, and later the Greeks, treated the location of these deposits as a closely guarded commercial secret. The Roman writer Strabo recorded that Phoenician captains would deliberately wreck their own ships rather than let a rival vessel follow them to the source. Whether that's literal or legend, it tells you something about how valuable tin was. Not gold, not silver, tin, a metal you can scratch with your fingernail. Overland routes carried Afghan tin west through Mesopotamia. Maritime routes brought Cornish tin south through the Bay of Biscay. Intermediary ports in Crete, Ugarit, and the Levantine coast served as hubs where tin and copper converged and bronze was produced. The system worked. For nearly 2,000 years, it worked remarkably well. And then, it stopped. Around 1200 BC, the system didn't just falter, it disintegrated. Within roughly 50 years, the Hittite Empire ceased to exist entirely. Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed and never rebuilt. Ugarit, one of the wealthiest trading cities in the ancient world, was burned to the ground. A letter, found in the ruins, never sent, begged a neighboring king for help. Enemy ships have arrived, my cities are burning. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated catastrophes in historical scholarship. There's no single consensus explanation. Drought, earthquakes, internal rebellions, all likely played a role. And then there were the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders whose origins are still disputed, who swept through the eastern Mediterranean in waves of destruction. Egyptian records describe massive naval battles against these invaders. But what's increasingly clear to researchers is that you don't need to pick just one cause. The Bronze Age world was a system, interconnected, interdependent, and fragile. And the tin trade was the thread running through all of it. Here's the logic, and it's difficult to dismiss. When the Sea Peoples, or whoever they were, disrupted the maritime trade routes, the flow of tin slowed or stopped. Without tin, you couldn't produce bronze. Without bronze, you couldn't arm soldiers, build infrastructure, or maintain the economies that held these civilizations together. A Hittite king's letter from this period survives, desperately requesting a shipment of grain and mentioning critical shortages of raw materials. The cascading failure wasn't just military, it was economic, logistical, structural. One missing ingredient, roughly 10% of an alloy, and the entire interconnected system had no fallback. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because civilizations were weak. It may have collapsed because they were connected.
Iron eventually replaced bronze, partly because iron ore was far more abundant and didn't require a complex international supply chain to produce. In a way, the Bronze Age collapse solved its own problem, but the pattern it revealed has never actually gone away. In 2021, a single container ship, the Ever Given, ran aground in the Suez Canal for 6 days. 6 days. The estimated disruption to global trade was roughly $10 billion per day. Semiconductors, fuel, food, medical supplies, all stalled because one node in a global network failed. The modern world runs on supply chains that are longer, faster, and more efficient than anything the Phoenicians could have imagined. They're also more brittle in exactly the same way. Tin and bronze built the ancient world's most advanced civilizations. And the loss of tin, a metal so soft you can bend it with your hands, so overlooked that most people couldn't tell you what it's used for, might have been enough to bring all of them down at once. That's not just ancient history, that's a design flaw. And we still haven't fixed it. So the Bronze Age collapse, that mysterious, almost simultaneous implosion of the ancient world's greatest powers, may trace back to a quiet metal that barely anyone remembers. Not the copper, not the gold, the tin. The 10% that held the other 90 together. Remove it, and the system doesn't bend. It shatters. History this old involves interpretation, and researchers continue to debate the relative weight of different factors. But the role of tin in this story is hard to overstate. If this one gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people. And if you're not subscribed to Object Origins yet, there's more here. The hidden stories behind the things we've always taken for granted.